Hi and welcome. The recent gains by the populist nationalist movements in Europe have made the radical left extremely worried. So worried that they have even manipulated or attempted to manipulate the voting process. In the Austrian presidential election in 2016, in the Swedish parliamentary and local elections this year, and most recently during the US midterm election, there were irregularities and even outright fraud. The political climate is changing. Right-wing nationalist sentiment is sweeping Europe and other countries around the world. We have seen the governments change in Italy, Austria, Hungary, the USA and Brazil. More countries will follow, but only if the election process is fair. In the Austrian election, there was a 147% voter turnout in Weidhofen, as well as several other voter fraud incidents. This was probably the first elections where the radical left turned to voter fraud on such a wide scale in a European country in modern time. It should have been a wake-up call to any real supporter of democracy. In the Swedish election this year, the radical left once again took to voter fraud. Intimidation of conservative voters, non-stop politically correct propaganda in the media, disposing the ballots of conservative parties so that people cannot vote for them, and also a very suspicious counting process took place in Sweden.
There was meddling in the Swedish election, but not by Russia. This was an inside job. Frankly, the results, though, of this election is odd. A tie between the different political blocs and the Sweden Democrats, although they gained a bit, still only the third largest party. And this nightmarish realization that we are going to get another 4 years of more of the same. So here are some of the major factors that contributed to what I see as meddling and definitely influencing in this election. 1. A Danish independent election observer, Mikael Astrup Jensen from the OSCE, Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe, called the Swedish election the most undemocratic he has ever seen. Jensen, who is from the left, Denmark's Liberal Party, has been to Russia to observe the elections there, but said that Sweden is well below the European standard, worse than anything he's seen. Why? Well, for a number of reasons. Let's go through them quick. Reports have been coming in from all over the country about polling stations that are missing ballots. The voting method is retarded in our country. In Sweden, there is a ballot paper for each party. In addition, the parties themselves must ensure that the ballot papers are printed and distributed. Some parties send them home to the voters. Others stand at the polling stations, shoving them in the hands, literally, of people. But there are also ballot papers in boxes at the polling stations. The election observer Mikael Astrup Jensen was in Malmö on the election day, where he saw how volunteers from various parties stood outside the polling stations, tried to push the voters to take their ballot papers. Jensen said, "We have to send the sharpest signal to Sweden that they need to introduce rules like those in Denmark and most other countries." The OSCE has called for reform of the Swedish voting process. The EU Commission has criticized the Swedish electoral system. Following the EU criticism, the government has proposed that ballot papers be kept in a special place in the polling station. Also, another negative side effect of ballots lying around in the open is that some undemocratic people have taken ballots from one or both nationalist parties and thrown them away. Dishonest and ultimately illegal actions, but these people think that they are saving the world from Satan. So, it's okay to do whatever it takes to stop bad people that are concerned with the direction of their country. So, a lot of testimony have surfaced online on Facebook and on Twitter of people sharing their stories of Sweden Democrats and Alternative for Sweden's ballots not being present at the polling station when they show up. Several videos and photos of hidden, disposed and thrown away ballots have come to light, and we don't know how many more that simply were not photographed or not filmed. Facebook posts by local politicians describe how they had taken ballots from the Sweden Democrats and AFS, Alternative for Sweden, and disposed of them illegally. These people are admitting to such behavior, and they need to be investigated and, of course, prosecuted if this is true. Let's talk more about some of the other points here. 2. Reports of people threatened at polling stations. One example, a Sweden Democrat chairman in Nynäshamn, Emilia Urpana, was threatened to have her, quote, head bashed in and, quote, murdered by 2 intolerant migrants. who threatened her due to her political leanings. She was called a racist and a bastard, and as they threatened her, they started to take swings at her, and as she is pregnant, and she was actually afraid that they would punch her in the stomach. 3. Tribal voting or collectivized voting organized by a single ringleader. In several places around the country, people have observed that immigrant Muslim men have handed ballots to their wives and others in their local community and directing them where to go, what to do, and ultimately who to vote for. Now, this is illegal in Sweden. We expect each man and woman to make up their own mind about who they want to vote for and not be told by a single person who to vote for and what to do. In another case, a helper, as they call them, had shouted a name of a specific party to get the larger group that he was directing to vote for this party. This is more of a 4. Dual citizens get to vote. In one specific case, there was a TV report made by a Turkish channel that 50,000 Turks no longer living in Sweden took part in this election. Dual citizenship is allowed in Sweden, so Turks no longer living in the country went to the Swedish consulate in Turkey to vote. And same thing happened there with these ringleaders. Representatives from the Center Party and the Social Democrats of Turkish descent were on location, telling the Turks to vote for the party that will keep the borders wide open in Sweden and make sure that our country continue to be a country looking out for foreign people's interest and ultimately being focused on saving refugees. 5. Many reports of people that showed up to vote and they have already been checked off in the electoral roll, the voter register. 6. The new Swedes that are imported into the country pretty much all voted for the Social Democrats. This was true in pretty much every predominant Muslim or immigrant majority area. These are just from some of the no-go areas that they, of course, have been trying to deny that they exist. S in these examples stand for Social Democrats, and you can see that they dominate in these areas. The Social Democrats have also released information and news in Arabic. On, for example, their Facebook page, they inserted propaganda about the other parties, primarily concerned with the nationalists, of course. The person writing it had actually ties to ISIS as well, Expressen reported. The Social Democrats, the left, and to a certain extent, the Green Party, they are seeing a large immigrant number as their key to continue to maintain political power in the country. 7. Länsstyrelsen, the county administrative board website that oversees the counting of the votes, was for, they say, safety reasons taken down during the evening as results started coming in. The election authority instead pointed people to SVT and other mainstream media news sources for incoming results. Now, what is interesting here is that no one has explained what then happened on the back end that allowed SVT or other mainstream news sources to continue being fed results and showing us these results. Was it just the front end of the site that was down? Can we see a record or a log of the counting, making sure that all of this actually went as it should have gone? But more worrying is that trends for the respective parties begun to change and alter at this point when the sites went down. For example, Sweden Democrats' results started going down significantly and Social Democrats started going up. Even val.se, the main site for the election authority, was down during an extended period. No explanation for this yet either. 8. The alternative news site liberated.se and newsvoice.se that both published articles with further information about the potentiality of election fraud had issues with their sites. Liberated had their accounts terminated by the web hosting company without any notice or reason given. Newsvoice is currently back up as of right now, but then also other news sites such as friatider.se, Free Times, were also subjected to DDoS attacks. This looks like a coordinated attack to shut down dissenting views that put attention to this potential voter fraud. 9. How much did all of this put together affect the election and the outcome? We don't know. There have been no thorough investigation of this, and I doubt that there ever will be. This is democracy, Swedish style, the most open, safe, and least corrupt country in the world, they say, where war is peace and lies is truth.
We have seen, for example, that there is statistical evidence that voter fraud was going on. For example, in the Frankfurt district Sachsenhausen, the AfD has only gotten 0.3% of the votes, whereas during the last election it was around 4%, and in all the neighboring districts this time it was between 4 and 10%. So this is, statistically speaking, absolutely impossible impossible. I mean, yes, there is a finite probability that this happens, but for practical purposes, we can say the probability of that being true is precisely zero. It's never to the detriment of the Green Party that this kind of stuff happens. So human error or an honest mistake can be ruled out absolutely. This was premeditated, this is systematic, this was planned. This kind of electoral fraud did not only happen in Sachsenhausen, that was just an example. Actually, in 80 districts for this state election in Hesse, the results had to be corrected. They Now, as a control mechanism, to my knowledge, only the total sum of the votes is checked afterwards. So even if you have, let's say, an AfD member present there, you cannot look at all the stacks, you cannot look at what everyone is doing at the same time. It's normally not possible. So, and here we already come to the mechanism that this electoral fraud is actually carried out. So normally in these inner city voting rooms, when everyone leaves, or like the voters leave after 6 p.m. and people look around in the room and they realize, they look each other in the eyes and the door is closed, the leaden seal is off the ballot box, and they realize, ooh, we're all Green Party members, we're all progressives, and we're the only ones in the room. Huh. And then, of course, they would just declare votes for the AfD, for example, as invalid, even though they're perfectly valid. Ballot was found that was sent in by mail, and the signature was not the signature of that person. So apparently there is some fraud going on here, and it's actually a gambit that the person that they steal this mail voting registration card from would not go to the election, because then no one will ever be able to tell. There were also cases where people were appearing at the wrong voting district. So everybody is told in their registration information letter that they receive where they have to vote. And people just appeared at several of these voting centers. And maybe if they know the person who organized this, they let them vote there. You know, if they just appear in the right room and their buddy actually organized that for them, they let them vote several times in a certain city. So they just go from area to area.
It seems so unreal that something like this would take place in countries like Austria and Sweden, who many still consider to be model countries. These countries are not model countries. They have been flooded with political correctness and multiculturalism for decades, and now this is the result. But the political climate is changing. People are starting to wake up. There is a growing opposition to the diversity nightmare being imposed on us by the globalists. However, we now have to make sure that our so-called democracies actually have democratic and transparent elections. Most importantly, we have to make sure that the counting process is honest. If the radical left can just fake the voting outcome, what difference does it make if the majority is voting for conservative parties? We have to control the voting process and make sure that it complies with good democratic standards. As Stalin once said, the people who cast the votes don't decide an election, the people who count the votes do. And that is absolutely true. This is the next step in the battle for Europe. We have to make sure that we have a fair and transparent electoral process. The radical left will do anything in order to hold on to power. As they lose ground, they will become increasingly desperate, and like a wounded and dying animal, they will be the most aggressive at the very end. In Sweden, it's the responsibility of the election committee in every municipality to recruit the personnel who will count the votes. Training is required, and a security check is also done. It's possible for anyone to apply for this type of work, and I encourage everyone who has the responsibility to do so. The same goes for every other country around the world. We need a fair and transparent election process if we want to keep our democracies. Freedom has to be fought for. An informed, active and determined people can achieve anything if they truly want to.